The history of human consciousness is written not in the language of progress, but in the dialect of transformation. Long before the therapeutic couch and the psychiatric ward, the alchemical laboratory served as humanity's first experimental theater of the psyche. Within those smoke-filled chambers, practitioners pursued what they believed to be the transmutation of base metals into gold. Yet beneath the surface of metallurgical aspiration lay something far more profound, a systematic cartography of psychological metamorphosis. Among the stages of the alchemical opus, one phase stands peculiarly illuminated, yet chronically misunderstood. Citrinitas, the yellowing, the dawn light, the solar awakening, occupies a liminal space in the transformative sequence, positioned between the mortification of nigredo and the whitening of albedo on one hand, and the final rubedo on the other. While the blackening and the reddening have captured the imagination of depth, psychologists and esotericists alike, Citrinitas remains the overlooked threshold, the golden hour that precedes full illumination. The question that inaugurates our investigation is deceptively simple. What occurs in consciousness when the darkness begins to yield, but before clarity has fully crystallized? What is the nature of that intermediate dawn when vision becomes possible but remains incomplete? The alchemists understood Citrinitas not merely as a chromatic transition in their retorts and alembics, but as a decisive moment in the economy of awareness itself, the instant when perception shifts from reactive blindness to nascent discernment. This is not the gold of completion, but the yellow of becoming. It represents neither the despair of dissolution nor the triumph of realization, but rather the awakening of the capacity to see, to perceive patterns, to distinguish essence from appearance, to recognize the workings of one's own psychic machinery. In Jungian terms, Citrinitas marks the emergence of reflective consciousness from the depths of unconscious identification. It is the moment when the subject begins to observe itself observing, when thought becomes aware of itself as thought. The relevance of this stage extends far beyond historical curiosity. In an era characterized by information saturation and psychological fragmentation, the Citrinitas phase offers a model for understanding how awareness itself transforms under pressure. It describes not what we know, but how we come to know, the revolution in perception that precedes any authentic revolution in being. The alchemical tradition did not emerge from a single source, but crystallized across centuries and cultures, drawing from Hellenistic Egyptian practices, Islamic natural philosophy and medieval Christian mysticism. By the time the great compilations appeared, the works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the treatises of Geber and Avicenna, the elaborate allegories of the European Renaissance, alchemy had developed a sophisticated symbolic language for discussing transformation. The opus magnum, or great work, was typically divided into distinct phases, though practitioners disagreed on the precise number and sequence. The most widely recognized sequence followed 4 or sometimes 3 primary stages. Nigredo, the blackening, represented dissolution, putrefaction and death, the necessary destruction of existing forms. Albedo, the whitening, signified purification and the emergence of a purified essence. Rubedo, the reddening, marked the final synthesis and the production of the philosopher's stone. Citrinitas, when acknowledged as a discrete phase, was positioned between albedo and rubedo, though some texts treated it as a transitional aspect of albedo itself. This ambiguity in placement is philosophically significant. Citrinitas resists fixed categorization precisely because it represents a threshold state, a becoming rather than a being. The term derives from the Latin citrinus, meaning lemon yellow or citrine, and the alchemists associated it with the sun, with gold in its nascent state, and with the awakening of solar consciousness within the practitioner. In the symbolic lexicon of alchemy, color was never merely decorative. Each hue corresponded to specific psychological and spiritual conditions. Black signified the chaos of undifferentiated consciousness, the massa confusa of raw psychic material. White represented the separation of pure essence from gross matter, the achievement of a certain detachment or objectivity. Yellow, by contrast, indicated the dawn of active intellect, not the cold abstraction of pure reason, but the warm, illuminating capacity to perceive relationships, to understand causation, to recognize patterns in apparent chaos. The alchemical texts are explicit on this point. The Rosarium Philosophorum describes Citrinitas as the stage where the sun rises in the philosophical work. The Aurora Consurgens speaks of the yellowing as the moment when the light of nature becomes manifest to the artist. These are not references to external phenomena, but to internal transformations of consciousness itself. When Carl Jung encountered these texts in the 1920s and 1930s, he recognized in them a sophisticated psychology disguised as chemistry. His interpretation of Citrinitas emphasized its role as the activation of consciousness after the traumatic dissolution of nigredo and the purifying detachment of albedo. In Jung's framework, Citrinitas represents the moment when the ego, having been dismantled and purified, begins to reconstruct itself in conscious relationship with the unconscious. It is the dawn of what he called individuation, not the completion of that process, but its conscious inception. Jung understood Citrinitas as the emergence of the capacity for discrimination, the ability to distinguish between projection and perception, between complex and reality, between archetypal pattern and personal neurosis. This is not intellectual knowledge in the conventional sense, but gnosis, a direct experiential knowing that transforms the knower in the act of knowing. The philosophical architecture of Citrinitas rests on several key principles. First, it posits that consciousness itself exists in gradations, that awareness is not a binary state, but a spectrum of intensity and clarity. Second, it suggests that increased awareness is achieved not through accumulation of information, but through a qualitative transformation in the mode of perceiving. Third, it proposes that this transformation cannot be willed directly, but must be prepared through prior stages of dissolution and purification. The Citrinitas phase operates according to what we might call the principle of emergent clarity. Just as dawn does not occur by decision, but by the necessary rotation of the earth, psychological illumination cannot be forced. It emerges when conditions are proper, when the darkness has been faced, when identification with rigid ego structures has been loosened, when the psyche has been sufficiently purified of reactive patterns. This emergence of clarity is characterized by several phenomenological markers. There is a newfound ability to observe oneself without immediate identification, a capacity to hold contradictions without collapsing into one pole or the other, and a dawning recognition of the symbolic nature of one's own psychological contents. Where previously the individual was unconsciously driven by complex and affect, now there begins to appear a space of observation, a witnessing consciousness that can perceive the play of forces within the psyche. The yellow dawn, then, is not a state of knowledge but a state of knowing, an active dynamic capacity rather than a static achievement. It represents consciousness becoming conscious of itself, awareness turning back upon its own operations. This reflexive turn marks the transition from psychology as something that happens to us, to psychology as something we participate in with increasing awareness and intentionality. The path through Citrinitas unfolds not as a linear progression, but as a series of deepening recognitions, each building upon the last yet remaining qualitatively distinct. The journey can be mapped through several identifiable movements, though the individual practitioner may experience them in varying sequences and intensities. The first stirring, recognition of patterns. The Citrinitas phase begins with what might be called the shock of recognition. After the dissolution of nigredo and the purification of albedo, consciousness finds itself in a new relationship to its own contents. Where previously emotions, thoughts, and reactions arose and passed, with the individual entirely identified with them, now there emerges a subtle distance, a minute space of observation. This initial movement manifests as pattern recognition. The individual begins to notice repetitions in their psychological life, the same argument erupting in different relationships, the same mood descending with predictable regularity, the same self-sabotaging behavior appearing in new contexts. What makes this different from mere intellectual acknowledgement is the quality of seeing involved. It is not that one thinks, "I tend to react this way," but rather that one observes the reaction in real time, sees it as a pattern, recognizes its archetypal structure. The alchemists spoke of this as the moment when the eyes of the understanding begin to open. In Jungian terms, it represents the initial activation of the observing ego, the witness consciousness that can hold experience without collapsing into identification with it. This is the yellow light of dawn, not yet full illumination, but sufficient light to distinguish shapes, to perceive outlines, to recognize that what one is seeing follows patterns that transcend the merely personal. The naming discrimination of complexes. As pattern recognition deepens, the work of Citrinitas proceeds to discrimination and naming. The psychological complexes that drive behavior begin to reveal themselves not as personal failings, but as autonomous structures within the psyche, each with its own logic, its own emotional signature, its own mode of consciousness. This phase requires rigorous honesty and a willingness to see oneself with neither inflation nor deflation. The individual must learn to distinguish between the ego and the complex, to recognize when they are being had by an autonomous content rather than acting from a place of conscious choice. This is delicate work, requiring what the alchemists called the patient fire, steady, sustained attention that neither forces nor abandons the process. The act of naming is crucial here, not the naming that fixes and reifies, but the naming that illuminates and clarifies. To name a complex accurately is to begin to establish a relationship with it, to move from unconscious possession to conscious dialogue. The father complex, the pure eternus, the wounded healer, these are not diagnostic labels, but archetypal recognitions, ways of seeing the universal patterns that manifest in individual psychology. What emerges in this phase is a growing capacity for psychological objectivity, the ability to observe one's own reactions as phenomena to be understood, rather than as inevitable responses to reality. This represents a fundamental shift in the locus of identity. The individual begins to identify less with the contents of consciousness and more with consciousness itself, with the witnessing awareness that observes the play of complexes and effects. The solar ascent, activation of active imagination. With discrimination established, Citrinitas enters its most characteristically solar phase, the activation of what Jung called active imagination. This is not imagination in the sense of fantasy or daydreaming, but imagination as a genuine organ of perception, a faculty capable of apprehending psychological realities that cannot be grasped through rational analysis alone. Active imagination involves a conscious dialogue with the contents of the unconscious. Rather than being passively overwhelmed by dreams, symptoms, and affects, the individual learns to engage them actively, to enter into relationship with the autonomous figures and forces of the psyche. This requires maintaining a difficult balance, remaining conscious and present, while allowing unconscious contents to manifest in their own forms. The alchemists understood this process intimately, though they described it in chemical metaphors. The conversation with the metals, the union of soul and lunar, the multiplication of the stone, all these phrases point to the same psychological operation, a conscious, sustained engagement with the unconscious, in which neither consciousness nor the unconscious dominates, but both participate in a creative exchange. In Citrinitas, this work takes on a specifically clarifying quality. The yellow light of dawning awareness allows the individual to perceive the symbolic nature of their psychological contents. A symptom is recognized as a symbol, a dream image is understood as a communication from the unconscious, a compulsive behavior is seen as an expression of an unintegrated complex. This symbolic seeing transforms the relationship to suffering. What was mere pathology becomes meaningful. What was chaos begins to reveal order. The trial of discernment, distinguishing inflation from insight. Every genuine psychological advance carries with it the danger of inflation, the unconscious identification with the archetype that has been contacted. Citrinitas is particularly vulnerable to this danger because the very clarity it brings can be mistaken for enlightenment rather than recognized as the beginning of seeing. The practitioner in the Citrinitas phase must learn to distinguish between genuine insight and spiritual inflation, between the activation of awareness and the ego's appropriation of numinous content. This requires what the alchemists called philosophical humility, a recognition that the light which allows one to see is not produced by the ego, but flows through it from a source beyond personal consciousness. The trial of discernment manifests in subtle ways. There may be a temptation to interpret every event symbolically, to see signs and synchronicities everywhere, to believe that one has grasped the fundamental patterns of reality. Or there may be a more insidious form of inflation, the quiet conviction that one has transcended ordinary psychology, that one is no longer subject to the common afflictions of the unconscious. The antidote to inflation is contained within the Citrinitas process itself, the continuous return to observation, the disciplined practice of witnessing one's own reactions without judgment, the recognition that every insight must be tested against lived experience. The yellow light reveals patterns, but it does not yet embody them. Seeing is not the same as being. Integration through practice, the work of sustained attention. The final movement within Citrinitas involves the translation of insight into practice, the embodiment of awareness in daily life. This is perhaps the most demanding aspect of the work, for it requires sustaining the observing consciousness across the full spectrum of ordinary experience, in relationship, in work, in solitude, in crisis. The alchemists emphasize that the great work required not momentary inspiration, but sustained, patient application. The philosophical fire must be maintained at the correct temperature, neither too hot nor too cold, through all the phases of the operation. Similarly, the Citrinitas phase demands consistent practice of awareness, a daily return to the work of observation and discrimination. This practice might take many forms: the keeping of a dream journal, the regular examination of conscience, meditation, active imagination sessions, or simply the habit of pausing throughout the day to observe one's internal state without judgment. What matters is not the specific technique, but the quality of attention brought to it, the same solar consciousness that has been awakened in the Citrinitas phase. Through sustained practice, the insights of Citrinitas begin to stabilize. The capacity for observation becomes more automatic, the recognition of patterns more immediate, the discrimination between ego and complex more reliable. The yellow light of dawn begins to establish itself as a permanent fixture in consciousness, no longer dependent on special conditions or peak experiences. Yet even as this stabilization occurs, the practitioner must recognize that Citrinitas is not the final stage. The yellow light reveals, but it does not yet unite. The discriminations it enables are necessary but not sufficient. The journey must continue toward the albedo, the final integration. But that continuation is only possible because Citrinitas has awakened the capacity to see the path ahead. Every authentic transformation of consciousness passes through crisis. The Citrinitas phase, for all its associations with dawn and awakening, contains within it a particular form of existential confrontation, one that is perhaps more subtle, but no less demanding than the dark night of nigredo. The crisis of Citrinitas emerges precisely from its essential quality, the capacity to see. As awareness sharpens and the patterns of one's psychological life become increasingly visible, a profound and unsettling recognition dawns. The individual begins to perceive the extent to which their life has been driven by unconscious forces, the degree to which what they took to be free choice was mechanical repetition, the ways in which they have been unconsciously enacting archetypal patterns without realizing it. This recognition can produce a peculiar form of despair, not the overwhelming darkness of total dissolution, but a kind of lucid hopelessness. One sees the machine of one's psychology with increasing clarity, observes the predictable patterns of one's reactions, recognizes the complexes that drive behavior, and yet one still finds oneself caught in those very patterns. Awareness alone does not produce freedom. The yellow light reveals the prison, but revelation itself is not escape. The alchemists warned of this danger in their descriptions of the yellow bile, or yellow melancholy, that could afflict the practitioner during this phase. Unlike the black melancholy of nigredo, which overwhelms and dissolves, the yellow melancholy is characterized by a hyper-awareness that borders on paralysis. One sees too much, understands too clearly, and in that very clarity finds oneself frozen, unable to act because every action is recognized as potentially another manifestation of complex, another unconscious pattern. Jung encountered this phenomenon repeatedly in his clinical work. Patients would reach a point in analysis where they understood their psychology with considerable sophistication. They could interpret their dreams, recognize their complexes, articulate the archetypal patterns at work in their lives, yet remained fundamentally unchanged. Understanding had not produced transformation. The light had come, but it had not yet warmed, had not yet catalyzed the final integration. This crisis reveals a fundamental truth about consciousness. Awareness and transformation are not identical. The Citrinitas phase can produce individuals who are extraordinarily aware of their psychological mechanisms, yet remain bound by them, capable of observing their neuroses in exquisite detail, but unable to move beyond them. This is the danger of what might be called spiritual voyeurism, the tendency to observe and analyze one's psychology as an intellectual exercise rather than engaging with it as lived reality. The existential weight of this recognition can be crushing. If awareness alone does not liberate, if seeing the pattern does not break it, if understanding does not produce change, then what is the purpose of the entire operation? Why undergo the painful dissolution of nigredo, the difficult purification of albedo, the demanding clarity of Citrinitas, if one remains fundamentally unchanged? This is the dark side of the yellow dawn, the recognition that illumination can itself become another form of entrapment. The practitioner may become addicted to insight, constantly seeking new revelations, deeper understandings, more sophisticated analyses, all while the fundamental structure of the personality remains unmoved. The light becomes not a means to transformation, but an end in itself, a new form of spiritual materialism in which one collects insights the way others collect possessions. The way through this crisis involves a recognition that may seem paradoxical, the acceptance that awareness alone is not sufficient, combined with the understanding that awareness is nonetheless necessary. Citrinitas must acknowledge its own limitations. It provides vision but not yet power, understanding but not yet embodiment, discrimination but not yet integration. This acceptance requires a specific form of humility, not self-deprecation or despair, but a realistic assessment of where one stands in the transformative process. The yellow light is dawn, not noon. It reveals the landscape, but does not yet provide the warmth that will allow growth. The practitioner must resist the temptation to force the process, to will integration into being, to demand that understanding produce immediate transformation. Instead, what is required is what the alchemists called philosophical patience, the willingness to remain in the tension of the yellow phase, to continue the work of observation and discrimination even when it seems to produce no immediate change, to trust that this stage is preparatory for something that cannot yet be achieved directly. The crisis of Citrinitas also involves a confrontation with temporality. The individual must come to terms with the fact that transformation unfolds according to its own timeline, that consciousness evolves through stages that cannot be skipped or rushed. There is a season for dissolution, a season for purification, a season for illumination, and a season for final integration. To demand rubedo while still in Citrinitas is to guarantee failure. This confrontation with time is particularly challenging in the contemporary context, where immediate results are expected and where the slow, organic unfolding of psycho-spiritual development seems increasingly alien. The Citrinitas crisis asks, can you remain present to awareness without demanding that it immediately produce freedom? Can you see your patterns without despair and without inflation? Can you hold the tension between knowing and being? The successful navigation of Citrinitas produces not a final state but a transformed capacity, a fundamental shift in the structure of consciousness that prepares the ground for deeper integration. The individual who emerges from this phase is not yet the realized adept of the alchemical opus, but something qualitatively different from what they were before, a conscious participant in their own becoming. The most immediate result of Citrinitas' work is the establishment of what might be called the witnessing consciousness, a stable center of awareness capable of observing psychological processes without immediate identification. This is not dissociation or detachment in the pathological sense, but a healthy capacity for self-reflection. The individual can observe their emotions without being entirely consumed by them, recognize their complexes without being wholly possessed by them, perceive their patterns without being mechanically driven by them. This witnessing capacity fundamentally alters the relationship to suffering. Pain does not disappear. The psychological complexes remain, the old patterns continue to activate, but the individual's relationship to these phenomena transforms. What was opaque becomes transparent. What was unconscious becomes conscious. What was simply suffered becomes something that can be understood and worked with. The neurosis does not vanish, but it is no longer experienced as the totality of identity. Integrated Citrinitas produces what Jung called psychological objectivity, the ability to see one's own psychological processes with something approaching the clarity with which one might observe external phenomena. This does not mean cold analysis or intellectual distance, but rather a warm, engaged awareness that can hold both the subjective experience and the objective pattern simultaneously. The discriminatory capacity developed during Citrinitas becomes a permanent feature of consciousness. The individual can now distinguish between different levels of psychological reality, between archetypal pattern and personal complex, between projection and perception, between the voice of the ego and the voices of the various subpersonalities and autonomous contents of the psyche. This discrimination is not achieved through intellectual analysis, but through direct perception. One simply sees the distinctions, recognizes them in the moment of their arising. This perceptual revolution has profound, practical implications. In relationship, the individual can begin to distinguish between what belongs to themselves and what belongs to the other, can recognize when they are projecting and when they are perceiving accurately. In work, they can identify when they are acting from genuine vocation and when they are driven by complex. In spiritual practice, they can distinguish between authentic, numinous experience and ego inflation, between genuine insight and psychological defense. The integration of Citrinitas also produces a specific form of freedom, not the absolute freedom of enlightenment, but what might be called freedom within constraint. The individual recognizes that they cannot escape their psychological structure, cannot simply will themselves into a new personality, cannot transcend the basic patterns of their psyche. Yet within those constraints, a new kind of choice becomes possible. One can choose how to relate to the pattern, can decide which complexes to engage and which to contain, can consciously position oneself in relationship to the archetypal forces at work in one's life. This is the yellowing in its fullness, consciousness that has been illuminated, awareness that has been activated, perception that has been refined. The individual now possesses the primary instrument necessary for the final work. A consciousness capable of perceiving and discriminating the contents of the psyche with sufficient clarity that genuine integration becomes possible. Yet Citrinitas also imparts a crucial understanding. It is not the final stage. The yellow dawn points toward the red noon of rubedo, the final synthesis in which what has been discriminated will be reunited, what has been perceived will be embodied, what has been understood will be lived. The light that reveals is necessary, but it must eventually give way to the warmth that transforms. The individual who has integrated Citrinitas stands in a peculiar position. They have achieved a significant measure of psychological clarity and objectivity, yet they recognize that this clarity is preparatory rather than final. They have developed the capacity to see, but they understand that seeing is not yet being. They have awakened the solar consciousness, but they know that the sun has only just risen. This position brings with it both satisfaction and longing. Satisfaction in the genuine progress that has been made, longing for the completion that remains ahead. The practitioner can take legitimate pride in the work accomplished, in the consciousness developed, in the capacity for discrimination earned through sustained effort. Yet they must also maintain the humility to recognize that the opus is not complete, that the gold has not yet been produced, that the philosopher's stone remains a goal rather than a possession. The yellow light does not fall from above. It rises from within where you have always stood in darkness, waiting to see what you already are.